The Shakespeare Book by D.K. Publishing. Introduction. Born more than 4.5 centuries ago, William Shakespeare is greatly acknowledged to be the greatest imaginative writer in the English language. He was a major poet, writing 2 narrative poems, 154 sonnets, and other verses. But above all, he was a poetic dramatist, the author or part author of almost 40 plays, which range from the most delicate of romantic comedies such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, and Twelfth Night, through a series of plays about English and Roman history, to the most profound tragedies, including Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear. Far from dwindling with the passage of time, Shakespeare's reputation and influence have grown from year to year. His works in their original text and translation into most of the world's languages and in an enormous range of adaptations are read, taught, and performed all over the globe. They have influenced countless other works of art, and nobody with a claim to a liberal education can afford to be ignorant of them. This book offers a comprehensive guide to his plays and poems, concentrating on their content and form while also considering their reception and influence. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Jock, As You Like It. Shakespeare in Stratford. William Shakespeare was baptized in Holy Trinity Church in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon, England, on Wednesday, April 26, 1564. His exact date of birth is not known, but since the 18th century, his birthday has been celebrated on April the 23rd. Shakespeare's father, John, came from farming stock and worked in Stratford as a tanner of white leather and a glove maker. John's wife, Mary, whose maiden name was Arden, came from a more prosperous background. They lived in the house on Henley Street, Stratford, now known as Shakespeare's birthplace, a place of pilgrimage for hundreds of thousands of visitors from all parts of the world every year. They had 2 daughters who died in infancy before William came along, and went on to have 2 more daughters and 3 more sons. The youngest, Edmund, was 16 years younger than William. Like his older brother, Edmund became an actor in London. Very little is known about him, except that he died at the age of 27, a few months after the death in infancy of his illegitimate son. Shakespeare was a businessman who played a major part in civic life, becoming alderman and rising to the rank of bailiff or mayor in 1568. At this time, church-going was required by law. Both at church and at home, Shakespeare would have gained the familiarity with the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and the Book of Sermons that is apparent from his writings. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sonnet 18. Stratford was a market town with a splendid church, a well-established grammar school where education for boys only was free, fine houses, and townsmen who were educated and wealthy. The records for the school are lost, but Shakespeare's writings show that he had a typical grammar school of education of the period. Such schools provided a rigorous training in oratory, rhetoric, and classical literature comparable to that of the university graduates studying classics today. From an early age, the boys were required to write and speak in Latin. In a scene in The Merry Wives of Windsor, Act 4, Scene 1, a boy named William is put through his paces in Latin grammar and quotes from a textbook prescribed for use in every such school. It is surely the most autobiographical scene in all of Shakespeare's plays. Marriage and children. As a boy, Shakespeare would have been able to attend and act in plays in Stratford. Touring professional companies regularly visited the town during his boyhood and youth, playing in the Guildhall while local amateurs put on entertainment, especially at Whitsuntide. Shakespeare probably left school when he was about 15. We don't know what he did for a living at first, but he may have helped in his father's workshop. When he was only 18, at the end of 1582, he married Anne Hathaway. She was 26. A daughter, Susanna, was baptized 6 months later. Twins Hamnet and Judith followed in late January or early February 1585. Hamnet died and was buried in Stratford on August 11, 1596. The location of his grave is unknown. William and Anne had no more children, Except for a passing mention in a law case of 1587, there is a gap in the record of Shakespeare's life from the birth of the twins to 1592 when he is first credited as a writer. The best guess is that at some point he joined a theater company, perhaps even one of those that visited Stratford as actor or writer or both. His wife and children appear to have stayed in Stratford. Articles are borrowed from the pronoun and be thus declined singulatere nominativo, hic hoc. William, the Merry Wives of Windsor. In 1596, the College of Heralds granted Shakespeare a coat of arms, bestowing on him and his descendants the status of gentleman and the right to be turned master. His father died in 1601, presumably at more than 70 years old, and was buried in Stratford. In 1602, Shakespeare spent the great sum of €320 for the purchase of 107 acres of land in Old Stratford. In 1605, he was wealthy enough to pay €440 for an interest in the Stratford tithes, entitling him to a share in the area's farming income, which would have brought him an annual income of around €40. In London, he lived only in modest lodgings. His daughter Susanna married the physician John Hall in 1607. Their only child Elizabeth was born 9 months later. Judith married a vintner named Thomas Quiney, with whom she had 3 children, all of whom died young. Elizabeth Hall died in 1670 and was Shakespeare's last descendant. Shakespeare's first text. The first reference to Shakespeare as a writer comes in 1592, by which time he was well established on the London theatrical scene. In 1593, his name appears in print for the first time, not as a dramatist, but as the author of the narrative poem Venus and Adonis. His second narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece, appeared in the following year. These poems were exceptionally successful and were reprinted more frequently than any of Shakespeare's plays. In part, this is because plays were written primarily to be acted, so many never reached print. In 1594, Titus Andronicus was the first of Shakespeare's plays to be printed, but it seems certain that he must have written a number of other plays before then. What when if I gain the thing I seek? A dream, a breath, a froth, a fleeting joy. The Rape of Lucrece. In 1595, he is named along with 2 actors, Richard Burbage and Will Kemp, as having been paid 4 performances during the previous Christmas season at the court of Queen Elizabeth I by a company of players formed late the previous year under the patronage of the Lord Chamberlain, Lord Hunsdon. From then on, he was the resident playwright of the most important theater company in the land. No other playwright of the period had so long and stable a relationship with a single company. Shakespeare was also an actor and a businessman with a financial interest in the company's success. Plays were normally the property of the acting company for which they were written rather than of their author. There was, however, a reading public for dramatic text, and about half of Shakespeare's plays were printed in his lifetime. These, along with the missing text, were assembled by his colleagues after he died and published as the first folio in 1623. The theatrical scene. Shakespeare grew up during a period of increasing stability and prosperity in England. Queen Elizabeth I was unifying the nation and patriotic sentiment was growing. The arts of music, painting, architecture, and literature were flourishing. Great works of classical and continental, especially Italian literature, were appearing in translation and finding a wide readership. Many of these were to provide Shakespeare with inspiration and with plot material for his plays. Hell hath no limits, nor is circumscribed in one self-place, for where we are is hell, and where hell is must we ever be. Mephistopheles, Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Both English dramatic literature and the theatrical profession developed greatly during the early years of Shakespeare's working life. A major development came in 1576 with the construction of the first successful professional playhouse called simply the Theatre in London. A new generation of dramatic writers emerged, including playwrights such as John Lyly and George Peele, with whom Shakespeare was to collaborate on Titus Andronicus. Figures from the later 1580s such as Thomas Kidd, Robert Greene, and above all Christopher Marlowe, author of plays including the 2-part drama Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus, The Jewel of Malta, and Edward II, were all to influence Shakespeare. Growth in the size of acting companies and in the popularity of theatrical entertainment encouraged the writing of longer and more ambitious plays, interweaving plot with subplot, tragedy with comedy, and diversifying with songs, dance, masks, and spectacular effects made possible by the increasing sophistication of theatrical design. Can this cockpit hold the vastly fields of France, or may we cram within this wooden, the very cast that did affright the air of Agincourt? Chorus, Henry V. Theatrical performances. Theaters of the time were three-story buildings with open roofs and uncurtained platform stages that thrust forward into the auditorium. Performances were given during daylight hours. At the back of the stage were doors from which the actors entered, and behind them the tiring house or dressing room. There was an upper acting level that could represent a balcony or the walls of a city. A canopy over the edge held machinery to allow the descent of gods. There was no scenery. Musicians had their own space. The audience stood at ground level or occupied the tiers of seating built into the walls. In London today, at Shakespeare's Globe on Bankside, there was a reconstruction of the Globe Theatre, originally built in 1599, for which many of Shakespeare's plays were written. In 1609, the company started to use a more exclusive indoor theater, the Blackfriars, which had more elaborate stage machinery. These new possibilities are reflected in the stage effects required by, for instance, Cymbeline and The Tempest. Indoor theaters were lit by candles, and as the candles required frequent trimming to keep them all alight, playwrights began to divide their plays more clearly into 5 acts. The Sam Wanamaker Playhouse at Shakespeare's Globe is an indoor stage that gives an impression of this kind of theater. The actors who first performed Shakespeare's plays were skilled professionals, required by law to be organized into companies under the patronage of a high-ranking person, such as a nobleman or even the Queen herself. A typical company was made up of 12 to 14 men, who could be supplemented by extras known as hired men. Some of Shakespeare's plays require no more than the standard number of actors, but in others the same actor would have had to play 2 or even 3 roles in the same performance. All female roles were played by boys. No professional female actors appeared on the English stage before 1660. This explains the relatively small number of female parts for each play, only 2 in Julius Caesar, Portia, and Calpurnia, and the same number in Hamlet, Ophelia, and Gertrude. But it is certain I am loved of all ladies, only you excepted, and I could find in my heart that I had not a hard heart, for truly I love none. Benedict, Much Ado About Nothing. Music and special effects. Music played an important part in performances, as is evident from the number of songs and dances in the plays. Actors would sometimes have accompanied their songs on lutes, and a band of playhouse musicians supplied incidental music. Ceremonial entries of royal persons and great warriors would be heralded by fanfares and drum rolls. Thunder could be imitated by the use of a thunder run, cannonballs rolled down a wooden trough, and it was even possible to imitate lightning by the use of special stage effects. Theaters were closed during the 40-day religious observance of Lent, and companies frequently went on tour in the English provinces. Since there was no custom-built playhouses outside London, they had to play in improvised settings such as inn-yards, the halls of great houses, guild halls, and even occasionally in churches. Facilities would be limited, so playtexts were adapted to suit the constraints of the new venues. A wealth of plays. Shakespeare was an extremely versatile playwright, constantly experimenting with new styles of drama and developing his range of subject matter and the depth of understanding of character throughout his career. His first plays include the light comedies The 2 Gentlemen of Verona and The Taming of the Shrew, The Bloody Tragedy of Titus Andronicus, and 4 plays, also more or less tragic in form based on English history, 3 on the reign of Henry VI and the follow-up about Richard III. All these were written before the founding of the Lord Chamberlain's Men in 1594. The end of that year saw a performance of his brilliantly plotted Comedy of Errors, in which he interweaves a tale of mistaken identity derived from Roman comedy with the romantic tale of a family parted but eventually reunited. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. Macbeth. As a successful playwright. As a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's Men from 1594, and no longer needing to work in collaboration with other playwrights, Shakespeare had more independence to write what he wanted, but clearly felt he had to provide his colleagues with the plays written in a variety of styles, keeping up an average of roughly 2 a year. Over the next 5 years or so, he wrote a dazzling series of romantic comedy: Love's Labour's Lost, A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, and As You Like It, along with more plays about English history, Richard II and King John, both in tragic form, the two parts of Henry IV, which featured the greatest comic character, Sir John Falstaff, and the triumphant sequel, Henry V, as well as the romantic tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, the somewhat romantic comedy of the Merry Wives of Windsor, which also has Falstaff as its center, and the Roman tragedy, Julius Caesar. My lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. Romeo and Juliet. His company acquired a new theater, the Globe, in 1599. For this playhouse, he wrote the last of his two romantic comedies, As You Like It and Twelfth Night. This is the period, too, of his greatest success to date, the tragedy of Hamlet. After this, his plays became darker in tone. They include the highly original, bitter tragicomedy, Troilus and Cressida, and two other plays, Measure for Measure and All's Well That Ends Well, which, although comic in form, raise serious moral concerns. In this period, he also wrote the profound tragedies of Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear. On the death of the Queen in 1603, his company became the King's Men. Collaborators and rivals. Around 1606, for reasons unknown, Shakespeare returned to his former practice of collaborating with other playwrights. Thomas Middleton, who, along with Ben Jonson, had emerged as his most serious rival, worked with him on Timon of Athens, but the only text of this play that has come down to us is incomplete. A new departure in dramatic style comes with Pericles, written with the minor playwright George Wilkins, a tragicomic narrative that foreshadows the later singly authorized Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. During this phase of his career, he wrote two highly contrasting tragedies of ancient Rome, the austere Coriolanus and the flamboyant Antony and Cleopatra, and with John Fletcher, some 15 years his junior, a now lost play, Cardenio, The Two Noble Kinsmen, and the play known in its time is All Is True, but printed in the first folio as Henry VIII. During an early performance of All Is True in 1613, the firing of a sage cannon set the thatch of the Globe Playhouse on fire, burning it to the ground. Shakespeare's career as a playwright ended with the destruction of the playhouse that had seen some of his great successes. In the last 3 years of his life, Shakespeare wrote little or nothing. He died in April 1616, leaving most of his property to Susanna and €150 to his younger daughter Judith. Among other bequests, he left small sums of money to 3 colleagues in his acting company, the King's Men: Richard Burbage, Henry Condell, and John Hemminges, to buy mourning rings, a common practice of the time. What makes him great? Why is it that Shakespeare, a long-dead author of plays conceived for playhouses very different from those of the present day, written in an increasingly archaic language, employing unrealistic dramatic conventions, and telling stories that are often remote from the daily experiences of his audience, should be celebrated in both English-speaking countries and elsewhere as an author of enduring significance? Part of the answer is that he was a master of both prose and verse. He could construct powerful pieces of rhetoric such as Mark Antony's speech to the Roman citizens in the Forum of Julius Caesar and the king's address to his troops before the Battle of Agincourt in Henry V. He could write beautiful passages of lyrical verse, such as the love scenes of Romeo and Juliet and the exquisite speeches of Oberon and Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He could write speeches that are both witty and comic, such as those that Lance addresses to his dog Crab in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, or of those of Bottom and his colleagues in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He could write with powerful simplicity, piercing words with simple statements such as Leontes' "Oh, she's warm" in The Winter's Tale, or Prospero's "'Tis new to thee" in response to Miranda's "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it" in The Tempest, or the largely monosyllabic reunion of King Lear and Cordelia. This is the excellent foppery of the world that, when we are sick in fortune, often the surface of our own behavior, we meet guilty of our disasters, the sun, moon, and stars. Edmund King Lear. Memorable characters. Shakespeare could also tell gripping stories. The overall design of the plays drives the plots forward, and sometimes there are complex stories with more than one plot, as in Hamlet or King Lear. He builds tension in individual scenes, such as the trial scene in The Merchant of Venice or in the banquet scene in Macbeth, with great dramatic effectiveness. He gives us a strong sense of individual character, making us believe in the reality of the people in his plays, often by making them speak in individual ways, such as the nurse in Romeo and Juliet or Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. Sometimes by making them behave in a manner that is at once unexpected but credible. Crucially, he is not judgmental or moralistic. Even the characters who behave badly, such as Paroles in All's Well That Ends Well, perhaps above all Falstaff in the Henry IV plays, or a villainous murderer such as Macbeth, can make us feel what they feel rather than pass judgment on their sins. His plays provide a wealth of complex and theatrically effective roles which offer rich and demanding opportunities to actors. Tragic roles such as Hamlet and King Lear, Lady Macbeth and Cleopatra, heroic ones such as Henry V and Coriolanus, wittily comic roles such as Benedict and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, and broadly comic ones such as Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream all provide actors with exceptional opportunities to demonstrate their skills. Stories for all times. Many of the stories that he tells, such as in King Lear or The Tempest, have a quality of myth or legend that enables people of later ages to relate to them easily. Some plays, such as the history plays in Julius Caesar, also have a political dimension that can easily seem relevant to issues of modern times. To speak of Shakespeare as the world's greatest dramatist is inadequate. It would be closer to the mark to speak of him as a philosopher, a psychologist, or a poet, possessed of the artistry that enables him to express his perceptions in dramatic form, and in doing so, render them with unique subtlety and communicative power. Structures of this book. This book offers a section on each of Shakespeare's plays, giving information about their major themes, a concise description of their principal characters, a breakdown of the action arranged by act and scene, and the full synopsis of their plots. This is followed by information about each play's reputation and impact over the ages. There are also informative sections on Shakespeare's narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and the Labor of Lucrece on his sonnets, and on his two other poems, The Lover's Complaint and The Phoenix and the Turtle. The exact order in which Shakespeare wrote his works is uncertain. In this book, we follow both the text and the chronology of the Complete Oxford Shakespeare, General Editors Stanley Wells and Gary Taylor, first published in 1986. It was reissued in 2005 with the addition of Edward III, which by that time was generally agreed to have been written at least partly by Shakespeare, and the full text of Sir Thomas More, a play that survives only in manuscript and to which Shakespeare appears to have contributed at least one fine scene. Come, you spirits, that tend immortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty. Lady Macbeth. Macbeth.